Escalation without a true endgame. That's the best way to describe what is happening for Vladimir Putin when it comes to the Ukraine war right now. What started as an operation to take Ukraine in a matter of days has turned into an absolute quagmire, and Putin is stuck right in the middle. He can't stop the war, that would humiliate him and likely lead to Putin being deposed by whatever sharks are waiting for his downfall. But Russia can't win the war either. It has proven that over the last 4 years. Even if Ukraine does fall, the damage Putin has done to his own country is so immeasurable that he won't survive the aftermath. Putin's endgame has begun, and all he can do is escalate without a way out. And to understand why, we need to look at how Putin's special military operation came to be and how it devolved into the utter failure that looks sure to set the stage for Putin's fall. It all started with a dream that a KGB agent who desired ultimate power had. Empire was on Putin's mind, an empire so large that it would rival that built by Joseph Stalin, and before him, the Tsars of Russia. Jack Bro, who is a US Air Force veteran and regular military commentator, puts it bluntly when talking about what Putin really wants. These wars are never going to end, Bro says. Putin is going for empire. If Putin succeeds in Ukraine, Moldova won't last very long. The Baltics are next. Putin is going to continue redrawing the maps and claiming this territory that once belonged to Russia. As the Atlantic Council reported as far back as April 2023, Putin himself has alluded to this desire to build an empire. He has openly compared the Ukraine invasion to the Imperial conquests of the Russian Tsar Peter the Great, seemingly in the hope that some of the past glories that Russia enjoys will somehow be rubbed off on himself. Putin claims that he is returning historic Russian lands to the motherland, framing the Ukraine invasion as the first step in a much wider campaign to return Russia to what he sees as its rightful place at the head of the global geopolitical table. This was always the plan for Putin. And Bro says that those who were paying attention would have noticed this years ago, long before Putin outright said it. Bro refers to Putin coming back to power in 2012, after he'd spent the previous 4 years serving as Russia's prime minister following his initial presidential stint. And as soon as Putin was back in the president's seat, he started taking some actions that, in hindsight, we can now see as the starting point for what was to come. As soon as Putin came back to power in 2012, Russia went into austerity mode to start saving money, because Putin was always planning on getting his empire back, Bro says. The World Socialist website reported on these Russian actions back in 2012, noting that the Kremlin had come up with a document called Strategy 2020 that outlined how the implementation of a series of austerity measures would return Russia to economic prosperity. And slowly but surely, the measures worked. Data from the World Bank shows that Russia's economy experienced a 7.8% decline in 2009. But by and large, it experienced growth in the decade to follow. Not always strong growth. 2016 saw just a 0.2% strengthening of the Russian economy, and there were years of decline, including 2015 and 2020. But things were a lot better for Russia than they were in the 1990s, albeit not as good as they had been during Putin's first tenure as president. At the time, it might have seemed to many that Putin was trying to right Russia's economic ship for the good of his country. Fast forward to 2022, and the real reason behind the austerity measures became clear. Russia needed money, as much money as it could get its hands on, and it needed it to fund an invasion of Ukraine. Not that Russia thought it would have to spend much of its stockpiled cash to complete that invasion. Leaked documents later revealed that Putin believed that Ukraine would fall to Russia's overwhelming military might in just 3 days. And once that fall came, Russia would have an enormous chunk of territory to add to Putin's budding empire, along with a foundation on which it could build towards taking the other countries that Bro mentions. Of course, we now know that didn't happen. Instead, Russia got bogged down in a war that is still very far from being over. A war that has cost Ukraine, Russia, and all those affected by Putin's empire-building ambitions a staggering $2.4 trillion, per the Center for Economic Policy Research in July 2025. Even now, Russia is spending billions to fund the war. TVP World said on December 19, 2025, that Russia will dedicate 7.3% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, to national defense and national security, indicating that Putin is going to keep the war going. He has to. Putin has no other options. He thought he might have options when US President Donald Trump came to power. Bro has commented on this, suggesting that Putin and Trump think similarly in some respects, which Putin hoped to take advantage of. He refers to neither seeming to take the leaders of Ukraine, the European Union, or the United Kingdom seriously, claiming that both seem to think that power comes down to who has the most nukes. That supposed parallel thinking, coupled with what can politely be called the Trump administration's lack of understanding of how to deal with a man like Putin, has led to Russia's leader making maximalist demands during peace negotiations with Ukraine. There's no peace deal that Putin would accept unless all frozen assets are returned and all sanctions are lifted, Bro says. That can't be done without the supposedly inconsequential leaders of the EU, Ukraine, and the UK. The EU alone holds 210 billion euros, or about $245 billion of Russia's frozen assets, and it's not going to hand them back anytime soon. Putin is also demanding that Ukraine cede the Donbass region, and he has tried to claim that the region is on the verge of falling several times, all to convince the US to support the version of peace that Putin wants. Sometimes it has worked. But when Putin gets in the way of what Trump wants, as we saw with the January 3rd capture of Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela, Trump has proven that he will take it without caring about Putin. Manipulation aside, and that is still very much in play for Putin, Trump being such a wild card makes him unpredictable. And that unpredictability means that the only real route to a peace deal that would allow Putin to come out of the war he started with a chance of being able to hold his head up is never going to be guaranteed. So, what's an authoritarian president who wants an empire to do when he's not getting his way? Well, escalate. Bro has alluded to Trump dreaming of receiving a Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the Ukraine war peace negotiations, even as Putin has repeatedly told the US that Russia wants peace while it's bombing Ukraine. I'm sure behind the scenes, the Russians are laughing their asses off, Bro says, adding that there have been clips of Russian media that amount to Russia trolling Trump and his apparent gullibility. Throughout 2025, Russia was making claims to want peace while constantly escalating in Ukraine. We see that in Russia's use of long-range drones against Ukraine. In its January 13th Russia-Ukraine report card, Russia Matters reported that Russia launched 5,649 drones at Ukraine in December 2025 alone. That was around triple the 1,881 drones launched during December of 2024. Beyond the aerial campaign, Putin has also escalated as best he can on the ground. The Kyiv Independent reports that Russia wants to recruit 400,000 soldiers in 2026. It already has around 700,000 service members deployed in Ukraine, which is a number so massive that very few of the world's militaries even come close to matching it. But behind this escalation and the attempted manipulations of the US that Putin has attempted to pull off, the cracks that indicate a pending collapse are starting to show. Let's start with Russia's spending. Bro claims that Putin has been able to sustain Russia's massive wartime spending in part because Putin orders Russia's private banks to give preferential loans to the defense contractors so they can keep producing. And over the last 3 years, they've accumulated $250 billion in corporate debt. This is not on the government's books. This is not on the government's balance sheet. It's on the balance sheet of these defense contractors, Bro says. The problem with loans, even preferential ones, is that they have to be paid back at some point. The massive influx of cash into Russia's defense industry sparked a boom period for a few years. But as the Moscow Times suggested on December the 26th, that peak may have come to an end in 2025. Forecasts for industrial output growth for 2025 sit at 1%, the outlet says, which is a substantial decline from the 5.6% seen in 2024. From computers and electronics to transport equipment to fabricated metal products, growth is slowing down, suggesting that Russia's collective defense industry is starting to run out of money to build the products that Putin needs it to build. These defense companies aren't hiring like they were either. In September, Novaya Gazeta reported that Russia's State Duma said back in November 2024 that Russia's military factories would be short some 400,000 workers in the near future. Salaries for defense contractors have dropped by 10% since 2024, the same outlet reports, with the Moscow Times adding that the summer of 2025 saw Russia's defense companies advertise 34,500 jobs compared to 52,000 during the same period in 2024. The bubble isn't about to pop, not just yet, but the needle is edging closer to that bubble, and when it reaches its target, the defense industry that Bro claims is propped up by dodgy private bank loans is going to feel the heat. Russia is breaking all of the rules of modern economics and capitalist economies to keep this war going, Bro says. Now 20% of national GDP is just corporate debt. This would be the equivalent of, let's say, the President of the United States forcing private banks to give $5 trillion in loans to American defense contractors so that the United States can invade Mexico. And after 3 years of fighting, we only got 50 kilometers deep into Mexico. It's stupid, Bro declares. It's also dangerous for Putin. This gamesmanship is obviously affecting Russia's economy as a whole. As the New Voice of Ukraine reported on January 6th, Ukrainian intelligence believes that Russia is in such dire financial straits that a recession is practically unavoidable. That recession will arrive before July 2026, assuming that current trends continue, and there's no reason to believe that they won't. As we said before, all that Putin seems capable of doing now is escalating the war that he started, because winning is the only option he has that won't see him take a swift fall out of a window once the war ends. However, it may not be the everyday Russian people that worry Putin the most. As Russia's leader approaches the endgame of a war that he can't win, it could well be the very oligarchs that he has installed that might spell his doom. After all, who do you think the victims of all of this corporate debt that Bro claims exists would be? And by victims, we mean the ones that Putin actually cares about. It will be the oligarchs who own the defense companies that received preferential loans in the belief that the war that has dragged on into 2026 will be done long before then. Now, people don't understand where is the risk, or who's going to get wiped out, and it's Putin's oligarchs. Putin's oligarchs are the ones who have the equity in these banks that are going to go bankrupt. It's Putin's oligarchs that have the equity in these defense contractors that are going to get wiped out. So when all of this collapses, it's going to be very bad for Putin and his government and the Russian economy, Bro declares. Now, you may be thinking that we're about to tell you that Putin's oligarchs are set to rise up and get rid of him. No, we aren't. As Chatham House reported in October 2023, Putin has already started to get ahead of the problem of formerly loyal oligarchs turning against him through a process of deprivatization of Russian businesses that is allowing him to install a new generation of loyalists. However, these new oligarchs are more middle managers than business tycoons. That's how Putin wants it, but that approach comes with some problems. As Chatham House says, deprivatization amounts to the dismantling of the institutions that Russia has come to know since the collapse of the Soviet Union. For a dictator like Putin, that means even more control. However, it also means that he is surrounding himself with politically weak yes-men who will say anything that Putin wants them to say as long as the money keeps rolling in. That money is increasingly facing obstacles, as we've already mentioned. But now, unlike when we had oligarchs operating in private businesses, Putin has total control but has sacrificed access to voices that might have told him what is actually going on in Russia. Even as Putin bankrupts a nation, those who are benefiting, however briefly, don't dare to tell him to stop. In other words, Putin isn't getting good information, and that situation isn't going to change, and it's causing major problems for Russia. As Bro puts it, a common theme among autocracies is the guy in charge gets mad when he gets bad news. So people just don't give him bad news. They tell him what he wants to hear, and that's when people start dying. And dying is what the soldiers in Russia's military have been doing best throughout the Ukraine war. As of January 14th, Ukraine claims that Russia has lost approximately 1,221,940 people to death, injury, or capture since Putin launched his invasion. 2025 has been a terrible year on the casualty front for Russia, at least if Ukraine is to be believed. The commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Oleksandr Syrskyi, said in January that Russia is now at the point where it's losing as many soldiers as it's recruiting, and the balance will only tip more in Ukraine's favor as the poorly trained replacements that Russia puts through the most basic of training come face-to-face with Ukraine's ever-growing wall of drones. Does Putin even know any of this? Or has he surrounded himself with sycophants to such a degree that he actually believes it when Russia claims to have captured cities like Kupiansk and Pokrovsk, even though both cities still stand? It's hard to know if there is anybody left who can tell Putin the truth, or even if he wants to hear the truth, as Russia's leader has geared his entire country toward creating an empire that has failed to expand at the very first hurdle. So, again, all Putin can do is escalate. More bombs, more drones, more soldiers, and more destruction of the Russian military inflicted by Ukraine. So where does all of this leave Putin? Whether he stops the Ukraine war or continues it, Putin still loses. As the George W. Bush Presidential Center's Jessica Ludwig wrote in December 2025, Putin has created a wartime leviathan in Russia that he needs to keep feeding. We already see this on the economic front. Russia's defense sector may be slowing down, but it's still one of the country's top employers, as well as being one of the pillars of the economy that Putin has created over the last 4 years. If the war ends today, that defense sector doesn't necessarily stop. Russia would need to rebuild its military, but it's already creaking under an economy that is running out of cash, meaning Russia would end up as a supposed global power with very little actual power. But perhaps more worrying for Putin, as Ludwig points out, is the lengths that Russia has gone to in order to sustain the massive manpower churn created by the meat grinder of the Ukraine war. Corruption is now rife inside Russia due to the massive payouts on offer to these soldiers. Ludwig claims that there is now a network of black widows in Russia who marry men, sending them off to Ukraine and then claiming the money those men got for themselves. That sounds sensationalistic. Less so is the fact that Russia has turned to its own prison population to reinforce its military. Up to 180,000 of them by January 2025, the Kyiv Independent reports, and the number may now be much higher. What happens when these criminals, along with the hundreds of thousands of men who have been forever changed by what they've seen in Ukraine, come back home? Ludwig suggests that we're already getting hints, as about 1,000 Russian citizens have been killed or injured by Russian soldiers who returned from Ukraine already. Ending the war now would mean a massive influx of brutalized and violent men flooding back into a society that seems in no way equipped to support them. A collapsing economy doesn't tend to offer many jobs to returning soldiers, much less jobs that pay anything like what those soldiers were earning for fighting in Ukraine. Ending the war would create a domestic nightmare for Putin. But his alternative is an endgame that seemingly has no end. The war continues in this scenario, which means that hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of Russians die or receive injuries due to the fighting. Putin is slowly working his way through an entire generation of Russia's men in an attritional war that, assuming Ukraine retains the support it's receiving from the West and continues on the same path that it's on, will likely be raging even when the 73-year-old Putin dies. Even if Russia does win in Ukraine, potentially years from now, the country still struggles. Years of economic hardship will be compounded by labor problems due to so many of the country's men dying. Birth rates will stay low, and they'd already reached a 200-year low by April 2025, according to the Moscow Times. The glorious expansion of Russia's empire would be followed by an extended period of Russia trying to recover from the catastrophe of a war that went nothing like Putin claimed that it would. Putin also has to worry about the ultra-nationalists in Russia who want total domination over Ukraine. These are the sorts of people who may strike if they see weakness in their leader, so keeping the war going means they don't get that chance. Perhaps there is one endgame for Putin at this point: escalate until he dies. Russia's leader will be hoping that death is a peaceful one, ideally involving no windows, and he may just try to keep the Ukraine war going until that death comes and he doesn't have to deal with the mess that he's made. After all, it's not like the future looks great for Russia and Ukraine. As soldiers continue to die in droves, Ukraine's Western allies are still offering plenty of support. The UK is among them, and it's working on the creation of a ballistic missile that Ukraine can use to devastate Russia. It's called Project Nightfall, and you can learn all about it if you watch our video. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to The Military Show for more analysis of the crumbling state of Russia.